Okay, Peter, break a leg.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, break a leg.
Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth plenary session that we are holding during this time for our 26th International Symposium in Applied Linguistics that is conducted by the Masters in Applied Linguistics TEFL from Universidad Distrital. We would like to welcome all of you to this plenary session, and we would like to remind you that you can leave your comments or questions to our renowned scholar via the chatting here. And by the end of the session, we will have a Q&A session to answer all the questions. We would like to welcome Dr. Peter Sayer. He is going to be our guest speaker for this plenary session. And we feel very honored, Dr. Sayer, to come with you in here in this plenary session. The name of the plenary session is Interrogating the Promise of Bilingual Education, English for Everyone and Social Mobility, from Dr. Peter Sayer from The Ohio State University in the US. Just a brief introduction, Dr. Peter Sayer is an Associate Professor of Language Education Studies in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. His more than 50 publications in educational sociolinguistics have appeared in Critical Issues in Language Studies, TESOL Quarterly, and the Modern Languages Journal. He is the current editor of the TESOL Journal and the author of the forthcoming book, The Sociolinguistics of Language Education from Multilingual Matters. Welcome, Dr. Sayer. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Jose. And thank you guys so much for the invitation to the symposium. Thank you to Dr. Alvaro and all of the organizing committee. I know it's not an easy job to organize something like this online. I'm getting used to it as well. So we'll see how this goes. But thank you guys so much for the invitation. It was actually, originally it was an invitation in person. I would be shaking your hand right now down in Bogota, Jose. So I'm very sad to have missed the opportunity. And I hope at some point, once all of the COVID madness is over, I'll have the opportunity to go down and meet everybody down there in person. But I just wanted to say felicidades to all of you for organizing such a successful conference. It's really well organized. I'm very impressed. So hopefully I can make my contribution here. As Jose mentioned, this is something that I've been really interested in and working on for a number of years now. I do work here I'm originally, I should say, from Canada, but I've lived in Canada, the United States, and also in Mexico. And so actually a lot of what I'll be talking about today is drawing on my work down in Mexico with the English language program down there. So I'll go ahead and jump into the topic here. You notice the title I've called English for Everyone, and that actually comes from an article by Martin Weddle, who in part says that he's writing here in the Journal of Educational Development, which I think is significant because the idea of English has been tied to development in many, many countries, right, including Latin America. And so Weddle says here that the past decades, we've seen the growing assumption worldwide that national government should provide, quote, English for everyone as a core component of their school curricula. Despite enormous financial and human investment, actual outcomes are often disappointing. So, I'm looking at this as well in Latin America, as I said, particularly in Mexico, and trying to kind of think about, how is this new tendency towards English, and particularly, I would say, what we call primary English, or PELT, primary English language teaching, which is this expansion, really massive expansion of English into the basic education curricula in many countries, right? And so Mexico, it was 2009. You there in Colombia, actually 2004, with your Programa Nacional de Bilingüismo, was one of the early ones, but this is certainly a trend which has, over the past 10 or 15 years, really, really pronounced in particularly in places like Latin America and, as well, I would mention Southeast Asia. And so this is, what's happening there in Colombia, what I'll be talking about here today for the next few minutes in Mexico. Really, we should understand this as part of a very pronounced global trend towards moving English into public education at the primary level. And why I think that's significant is, as I mentioned with the idea of English for everyone, is because this expansion of English into primary education, it's discursively, it's tied very closely to the idea of modernization of the education systems in many of these countries. And it's based on this argument of increasing the competitiveness of the countries in a global marketplace. What do you need to do to increase your competitiveness? Well, as we say, the argument, inglés y computación, right? English and computers. That's what's going to sort of make our education systems modern and make us more competitive in this global marketplace, right? And so, another way of saying this, English for everyone, that the strategy that they're adopting to get to English for everyone is this idea of what I've been calling more and earlier approach. We're trying to teach more English, and we're trying to introduce it earlier and earlier into the public school curriculum, right? And again, very much tied to this idea of economic development. And so, again, you can see that there's lots of folks in applied linguistics and TESOL who are looking at this phenomenon in different contexts, right? And so I would say there's sort of a growing body of work now. And I know that Mario Lopez Gopar, who was speaking earlier as one of your plenaries, is also a very important name in this area as well, and has been doing some wonderful work, as well as a number of folks that you see there in Colombia as well, who I think are really important voices, particularly in understanding how this phenomena gets taken up in Latin America, right? And so, in general, what we can say about what's been happening with these very sort of large, ambitious public English programs in primary schools, the general consensus is that they've had suffered from a number of problems that you see here, right? In terms of infrastructure, in terms of finding qualified teachers, in terms of the ways that the policies have been implemented top down, and in terms of trying to, really have the resources to support the ambition of the program. And so, you all know better than me what the situation is in the context there in Colombia. But from what I've understood, talking to some people, that holds true in Colombia as well. It certainly does in Mexico, right? And so, again, you'd say that this is a phenomena that really merits a lot of attention, investigation, in order to understand sort of how do we make these programs the way that we want, but also sort of what are I would argue here, and what I'm trying to get at is, what are sort of the underlying forces at work here within these programs, and how do those forces shape what happens with teachers and students in classrooms? And so that's what I want to try to show here, is sort of a connecting from sort of the larger macro kind of discursive level down to the classroom level. And so one thing that folks in Mexico told me over and over again when I would ask the question, like, do you think it's important to learn English, and why? And they would often say, pues sí, claro, porque el inglés te abre muchas puertas, ¿verdad? And that expression, el inglés te abre muchas puertas, was one that you heard over and over again. I know that's even the name of the program there in Chile, right? The English Open Doors program. And this is, again, very much kind of strikes at sort of the metaphor, this imagination that we have of the fact that English is this language of opportunity that leads then to socioeconomic mobility for the people who can learn English. So therefore, putting English into the public school is great, right? Because it provides all of these wonderful opportunities. And so that's kind of when I say interrogating that promise, that's what I want to get at, is sort of thinking carefully about what does that actually mean? How does that actually work, right? Does teaching English in public schools actually increase opportunities? We know that there's been some important work in critical applied linguistics by people like Cook and by Canagaraja and others that look at sort of how does that phenomenon of the expansion of English in all these places, how does it really get taken up? Cook argues that really it's constructed around what he calls the myth of international English. It's more fiction than fact there. And so, when we're looking at the promise of English for everyone, we do need to recognize that, there is a material reality to this, right? That English really is the main global language, and it really is important to give students access to opportunities to learn English, right? And so we can't deny that English isn't important, and that that isn't opportunities that parents want for their children, for example. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that in order to implement these programs, particularly large-scale public programs, these are like really, really expensive and take a lot of resources, right? And so again, it's worth asking, as we say in economics, is a cost-benefit analysis, right? Is the benefits that we get from these programs, is it worth the cost to implement them, right? So I think that's the question. The particular kind of version of that question that I want to talk to you with you here today is this: how is the implementation of public English programs in Latin America shaped by social class? And so I would kind of echo the work by David Block and others to say that, we really need to think carefully about the role of socioeconomic status or social class in how these programs get shaped. And I think in particular, the case of these public primary English programs really help to sort of illuminate what's happening with social class across, education reforms more broadly. And so I want to use a case study, using Mexico as kind of a case study to look at this question. Because I think in Mexico, probably much like the history in Colombia and other countries, historically, Mexico has had sort of a policy, if you want to call it that, de facto policy anyway, of what we would call elite bilingualism. Meaning, right, if kids that are at the higher end of the socioeconomic ladder, they go to private schools. The private schools include English, or there's some version of a bilingual program already. So they're able to learn English, and that gives them access to other sorts of possibilities that, English speakers would have. Whereas kids who are in the public school, they don't get very much English until in Mexico until, much later at the prepa level. And then the instruction isn't very good. They don't learn English. And so again, it sort of recreates this version there of elite bilingualism, sort of who has access to English, to quality English language education. And so the idea then of moving then English into the public primary schools really represents a pretty major shift in language education policy from, as I said, historically from elite bilingualism to what we would call macro acquisition of English, meaning like English for everyone, right? Let's try to get everybody the opportunity to learn English, which again, on the surface, that sounds great. We can't argue that that's not an important thing. And so again, this is sort of part of the kind of a basic plank in the platform of the National Development Plan, dating back to when the program was implemented about 10 years ago. And so, as you see there, that the language of it is kind of emphasizing the fact that English then would be an integral part. And they even tie it like almost specifically to socioeconomic or social class. They say here the English program was implemented as a measure to reduce the disparity in quality between private and public schools. And so, if you want to even out kind of level the playing field between private schools and public schools, put English in there, and that will raise the public schools up to that level, because again, now everybody has access to English, right? At least that's the argument. And so that's kind of what I want to look at here. And so, in terms of I'm going to share with you a study we did as part of kind of a larger program evaluation we did with the SEP, which is the Ministry of Education in Mexico. And so what I want to do is, kind of tie looking at the classroom level, looking at interactions here, and I'll show you some examples of kind of typical lessons in different schools, tie this to the program and then to the language education policy level, right? And so this kind of approach of trying to tie specific observational or interactional data at the classroom level up to a policy level is what Johnson and Rosento referred to as an ethnography of language policy. And so to kind of illustrate this, what I want to do is take a comparative case study approach, right? And what I'll do is I will give you, oops, I forgot to fix that. I'll give you I'm going to compare across 3 schools. Sorry, the first school is called Benito Juárez, which is a working class public school. The second school is called Jardines, which is the middle class school. And the third school is called Las Lomas. I apologize for the typo there. And that's an affluent school. And so what I'm doing is sort of taking an example and comparing across the 3 levels of the socioeconomic stratus there, right? You can see in terms of how I map that out in terms of the average income level of the parents of the kids in those schools, right? And so let's look at these three examples, and I'll kind of describe 3 lessons to you, a kind of a typical lesson in each of these schools. And again, what I'm drawing on, I'm giving you sort of a snapshot, un retrato here of the lessons in the schools, but I'm drawing this again from a much larger mixed method study. And so here's Benito Juárez, as I said, very typical kind of working class primaria there in Mexico, and gives you, the photo there kind of gives you a sense of what the school would look like. If you go into the classroom, you'll see that the classes are quite large, usually 40 or more students, sitting in pretty neatly organized rows. And in this class that we come into today, what you'll see is actually that you don't see the teacher there. If you see the person at the front of the room there, you can just barely see her head. That's actually one of the students. And what she's doing is she's copying sentences onto the board. The teacher's actually standing just out of the picture right by the door, the open door over there. He's standing kind of off to the side, and it's one of the students. He's given one of the students a grammar sheet, and the student is copying the sentences from the grammar sheet onto the whiteboard. And the students then are taking the grammar rules from the pizarrón, and they're copying them into their notebooks. And so the student did that then for quite a while. You can see there in the picture, she almost filled up the whole board from top to bottom. She waited for a little bit for the students to kind of catch up, copying it into their notebooks. Then she erased the whole board and she started again and filled it up top to bottom. The class lasted about 45 minutes, and that was the entire class, was her basically filling up the board from top to bottom, I think 3 or 4 times. So the students had filled up basically a whole page in their notebook. This is what the student's notebook would look like. And the grammar rules that they were copying, again, this was from a sheet that looked like a photocopied sheet. I'm not sure where the teacher had gotten it from, but he'd gotten it from somewhere, that he asked the student to copy for them. That here's an example of a grammar rule. It says, when we use an auxiliary verb, the adverb is placed between the auxiliary and the main verb. This is also true for to be, subject plus auxiliary plus adverbs plus main verbs. And so it gives you a sense then of what's happening in the lesson. And this was quite typical, as I said, for lessons in these working class schools, like copying grammar rules, copying word lists, copying sentences. You get the idea of what the theme is here, right? Lots and lots of copying. And so, this was pretty typical of the school. And so after what I was doing, one of the methodologies I was doing, I would do an observation of what I asked the teachers to show us was a typical class. And then I would do kind of a debriefing interview there and get the teacher to kind of talk about what happened in the lesson. And so, I asked the teacher, it seemed the teacher now, this was the upper grades, it goes up to grade 6 in Mexico. So most of these kids had kind of come through the English program now and had studied English for many years. And yet he was getting them to copy grammar rules with the verb to be. So I asked him, I was like, well, now that students start studying English, much earlier, they're supposed to have a higher level when they come to your class. So how has this affected your teaching? Basically, I was asking him, like, would it occur to you to kind of like raise the level a little bit? The teacher said, well, no, really, because the problem is that even when they get here to the upper grades, they still lack many of the elements. They don't remember what a verb is, what an adjective is. So I have to go step by step again. And so basically, again, in his mind, he was sort of explaining why it was that he had to take this sort of very basic approach, because at least the students in his school, you have to go step by step or sort of back to basics, right? And so here you get a sense of, these are the characteristics of English lessons in these working class schools. You see here mostly whole group instruction based on vocabulary and grammar. The students will answer, all chorally, raising hands, shouting out answers. As I mentioned, lots of copying. There's an emphasis on correct spelling. As you saw in the sheet there, they have to use different colored pens to indicate capitalizations and things like that. Word lists with translations, and so forth. So it gives you a sense of, this is what English classes look like in the majority of the schools in this socioeconomic level. Let's go like across town now. And we're still in one of a sort of a mid-sized city in kind of south central Mexico. And the schools we'll call it Jardines. This is also a public school, but this school is in a, pretty much a middle-class neighborhood. You get the sense there from the photo that, the paint looks newer. You see that there's an actual working projector up on the ceiling there. Generally the kids have sort of nicer tennis shoes, and, you get a sense that the social class of the kids' families is a little bit more comfortable, right? And the physical environment of the school looks like it. But it's also reflected in an interesting way in sort of what the teacher does. And so here's a typical lesson that I observed at this school. The kids were doing doing role plays, and so the teacher had asked them. I think the topic of the lesson was, what do you do in your free time, or free time activities, or something like that. A very typical kind of fairly basic English lesson. But in this case, rather than copying grammar rules, the lesson consisted of the students developing their own little sort of role play skits here, and then they had to go up after they prepared that and memorized it. They had to go up in front of the classroom and perform their role plays. And so here was an example of a role play that Victor and Julian did. They say, hi, what's your name? My name's Julian. Do you want to be my friend? Julian says, maybe. Do you like to play soccer? Yes, I like to play soccer every day. Great, let's go to Jardines to play. What's your number? I'll send you a what's, right? And so, again, nice little kind of example of a pretty basic interaction there. But what you notice is, kind of the difference between asking kids to develop their own dialogue based on a topic and then present an actual, interaction there, versus copying. And it turned out that this teacher that had organized this lesson here, that had planned this lesson, she actually taught in two different schools. The school that we just observed, Jardines, the middle class school, and a school that was more like the first one, Benito, Juárez. And so I asked her, well, that's really interesting. So, what is the difference between these two contexts where you work? Look there on line 4. The teacher says, well, for example, in this topic, the class was about expressing likes and dislikes. I had explained how to express your likes. I gave them the elements and how to talk about what you don't like. And they listened to a recording of a conversation. And then I told them, now create a dialogue talking about what you like. So they choose the theme. They developed their dialogues however they wanted. And in the other school, I just had to bring them the dialogue already completed, and they would just reproduce it, basically. And I said, well, because they can't create one of their own. Oh, yeah. So that's different, right? Here, the teacher says they can express their own meanings. In the other school, they can't really do that. You just have to kind of give it to them, right? And so at least, again, you can see kind of how this teacher and the first teacher as well, this idea of we have to go little by little. We have to kind of go back to basics because, again, the students aren't capable of going beyond that. They can't remember what a verb is. They can't express their own meanings. So we have to kind of give it to them. We have to script it for them and they can copy it. Whereas the students at this school, they were able to sort of create their own dialogues to express their own meanings, right? And I think that's a really important distinction. It's not just that the teachers were using different kinds of activities, but the reason why the teachers thought the one activity was appropriate for the first context and a different activity was appropriate for the second context. I think that's a really important insight, right? How the sort of the rationale, that kind of the logical explanation that the teachers give is based on what they think the possibilities are, what are the potential of the students in order to be able to handle it, right? Or sort of, again, it's about learning English, but it's about what the kids could actually, do with the English or the underlying meanings there, right? And so, again, when you saw the kinds of pedagogical approaches that the teachers in middle-class neighborhoods would use, again, it was more like the example we saw, more like those role plays, more like things like, you would see them with the middle picture there. There's giant cardboard dice that the teacher had made, and then the students, it was some kind of game. I can't remember what the rules were, but basically the students would roll these gigantic dice. They were out in the patio area, and then they would be running around, using English and yelling things in the patio. In the working class schools, they say, oh no, we couldn't do things like that because the kids will get too wild and out of control. So you kind of have to keep them kind of in their seats and focused. Whereas in the middle class school, this was, a very fun kind of kinesthetic activity, right? And likewise, you see the poster on the right there. Again, the students are sort of making up some kind of an advertisement. I don't know, they're trying to sell a PlayStation or something like that, right? But again, this is their own sort of decision making there of like what they want to sell and how they're going to produce it. So these were, again, the characteristics that would that kind of give you a sense of the pedagogical approaches in middle class schools that also kind of distinguish them or different than the working class schools. Again, there was a lot of whole group instruction, but there was usually you would mix it up a little bit by introducing a small group or a more kinesthetic activity. And you would try to kind of infuse elements of like fun somehow, games, competitions, things like that into the lessons. And the teachers would think about some kind of, communicative context here for the lesson. Again, what we would say basic, communicative language teaching kind of approach, right? And, there was some evidence in the lessons of, an idea of intercultural awareness, comparing and contrasting holidays and things like that. Often the teacher would ask the students to use English in other sorts of ways in the class, like for classroom management, for asking to go to the bathroom, things like that. And so there was still a focus on language forms, particularly with vocabulary, but the students would have opportunities to express their opinions and to produce work based on their own ideas, right? If we go to the third school then, this is an affluent private Catholic school that named, we'll call Las Lomas. And this school uses a bilingual curriculum. You can see obviously that the physical building itself, there's a super, super fancy, right at the bottom of the picture there, their basketball court is out of some like special rubberized material, and basically they're really nice. And so again, obviously that the physical building reflects the socioeconomic possibilities of the families who can, afford to send their kids there. And they're also sending them there, and they are sending them to a school that also uses partially an English as a medium of instruction. So it's a bilingual school in the sense that the students are, for part of the day, several hours a day, taking like science class in English, and they actually have to buy textbooks. And often they will use textbooks from like the United States, from the state of Texas or something like that. These are textbooks that were actually produced for English native speakers, and they're studying what we call the content areas, like science in English, right? And so here, for example, they were doing a project that was to, there had been some flooding in Veracruz, which is another one of the states nearby. And so the teacher decided, well, it would be very good and sort of to make English very relevant for them. Let's make a poster in English. And then we're going to bring that poster down to the Zócalo, which is the main plaza in the city where there's a lot of tourists that would come through. And then we're going to ask the tourists to contribute money, and then we'll send the money to one of the organizations in Veracruz. And so that, this is a very like real world use of English as a way of like helping, to help the flood victims in this other state. And so, the teacher says, well, it's pretty obvious the difference between the teacher, again, had worked in two different schools, very common for teachers to have to kind of split their time and morning and afternoon in different schools. Here she says, it's pretty obvious the difference between this one and the public school, you can tell. For example, there's just a whole range of tools here at the private school. There's a bunch of good materials, like books and audios and videos, computers and internet connection. And they have their own designated English classroom. And so she said, that's the big difference, because the students, they're coming into this context, the English classroom, and they're going to be hearing and using and learning it, right? And so in the affluent schools, you see that English is used as the medium to access other forms of academic and scientific knowledge, such as taking science classes in English. They're using English to integrate with other social practices, such as using English to find information on the internet. They're teaching English to connect to developing critical thinking skills and independent decision-making. Intercultural awareness is assumed. Many students have even traveled to the US. Their families have visas and things like that. English is taught within a bilingual mode with materials geared towards English native speakers. And so, again, if you contrast those three approaches, you see that there's some pretty, stark, obvious differences there in terms of like the patterns and what it looks like to teach English across different socioeconomic schools at different socioeconomic levels. And so, when we think about kind of interrogating the assumptions behind this idea of English for everyone from a language education policy perspective, we have to recognize is that, this idea of English open doors, this idea of English gives you opportunities in economic mobility, is something that we need to really call into question. Particularly, I said in the example in Mexico, the program, the current version of the program is called PRONI, Programa Nacional de Inglés, and this represents really a massive expansion of English language education, the largest expansion in Mexico's history. You are basically expanding education since tercero de kinder, and which is expanding it to about 17.2 million children in primary. It's something like 100,000 English teachers that they had to hire. So, it's a big deal. And so, again, I think it's fair to ask the question, does greater access to English acquisition really support social and economic mobility? And whose interests are being served by expanding English education? So, this is, as I said, part of a sort of larger kind of policy debate, language education policy debate, I would say. On the one hand, you've got policy experts like Van Perry. And he says, here's the quote here, he says that the spreading of worldwide lingua franca, he's talking about English now, is a positive and important trend from what I regard as the ultimate standard, egalitarian global justice. It enables not only the rich and powerful, but also the poor and the powerless to communicate, debate, network, cooperate, lobby, and demonstrate effectively across borders. People committed to egalitarian global justice should not only welcome the spread of English as a lingua franca, but see it as their duty to contribute to this spread in Europe and throughout the world. So, pretty strong statement sort of in favor of, this is actually a really, really good thing. We have to figure out how to implement it. Yes, it might be expensive, but, it's a positive thing. Versus, another big name in the area of language policy is Tom Rosento. And Rosento's basic argument is that English can't be, as he says here, parachuted into low-income communities like aid packages, and that English is not the ticket to social and economic mobility. So you've got an argument there, real contrast between folks who are arguing that global English supports greater access and social justice, and the ones who are arguing that just the opposite, right? Global English actually exacerbates inequality. And so my way of sort of looking at and giving you these three examples here, these three different snapshots of these classrooms, is based on this approach by Jean Anyon. Jean Anyon was a critical Marxist scholar of education, and she used this approach to describe what she calls the hidden curriculum of work in classrooms. And what she says is that the educational processes in classrooms tend towards social reproduction along social class lines, right? And so she gives the example here of she used the example of math classrooms and the idea that in working class schools, the lessons, and you saw it here in the example of the English lessons, that in working class schools, the emphasis was on accurately reproducing scripted language and rules, right? Here's the grammar sheet, now copy the grammar sheet, do it quickly and do it accurately. That's sort of the way that you're being judged on how good you're doing in English class. Whereas, in the middle class schools, you can see there's more, working within these communicative guidelines to create your own content. And in the upper class schools, again, English is a medium of instruction using American textbooks. And so again, from Anyon's sort of point of view, this sort of reveals how the hidden curriculum is shaping the underlying processes there of the decision-making that's going on in the teachers' minds. And I said, as the teachers were even explaining, well, in the working class schools, we have to kind of go back to basics because the kids don't have, even the basic knowledge of a verb and things like that. That's why I have to sort of tell them exactly how to do it, versus sort of the explanation that the others teachers have of, again, why they would organize their lessons in certain ways, right? And so, again, if we think about this, again, through this lens of the hidden curriculum, what Anyon would say is, well, that actually makes a lot of sense. What the teachers say, you can say, well, that's an example of a bad English lesson versus a good English lesson. So it's not really so much about that. It's not about us as researchers going in and sort of evaluating good English teaching versus bad teaching, good method versus bad method. Rather, again, understanding the sort of rationale or like what shapes the different approaches here. Because as I said, this wasn't sort of a random thing. It just didn't happen that just by coincidence, the teacher gave what we might consider a bad lesson versus a good lesson. I said this was really a pattern that was strongly shaped by social class, right? And what Anyon would say is that, well, that makes sense. And it makes sense if we look at it sort of from a, she said, think about, the classic factory situation here. In English, we call the widget factory, which just is a generic word meaning like, think about all the people in this that work in this factory making whatever these little things are, widgets, right? Some little machine or something. Look at all of the workers here in this factory and think about like, well, which of these workers actually need like language skills? Which of these workers need like strong, communicative skills? Well, the ones that are, the manager on the phone here, or maybe that guy there with the clipboard, maybe they're the ones, placing the orders and dealing with problems. And maybe those, the sort of middle manager guys need the language skills. But all of these workers, the guys, sitting there on the machines, they don't actually necessarily need a lot of, very sophisticated language skills. What they need is to be able to, do things quickly and accurately, right? And so we'll think about it in those terms of like sort of what are the actual skills that the students would need, and what are the sort of the dispositions that we are inculcating through the education in these schools. Well, I'll go back to the grammar lesson here. As I said, the lesson seems to be, the point of it isn't really about the verb to be and the auxiliaries. It seems to be about getting students to quickly and accurately copy down for like a long, long time. You have to have a lot of stamina to sit there for 45 minutes straight writing in your notebook, right? And so again, there's no pay attention to contextualized communicative practice, but there is a lot of attention to things that would seem irrelevant, like the details of underlining certain words or using certain colors for certain things, right? If you think about it like that, well, maybe for working class kids, studying English is less about learning the language itself and more about learning how to follow formulas accurately and quickly in order to make them efficient workers, right? I would point out that the school where I said Benito, Juárez, it's actually a school that's right near a major automotive plant. Nissan is one of the main car manufacturers there in Mexico. And so actually a lot of the parents of the kids at the school, they work in the auto plant, in the Nissan factories, right? And so, you start to think, well, maybe there's something to it, right? You could also say, well, nowadays, actually, a lot of the manufacturing plants, they're highly automated. So maybe it isn't really that, you don't just not need linguistic skills. Maybe you don't need anybody in there at all. Here's an example of the Modelo beer factory, gigantic factory. It's almost completely automated there. There aren't any, workers working on making little widgets and things like that. Rather, nowadays, you might say, well, the sort of what we call information age jobs that you need, like these call centers here in Mexico City, well, maybe you really do need the linguistic skills in order to do those sort of entry level jobs that do require those sorts of skills, right? And so you could say, well, maybe that's where this idea of macro acquisition is targeted to, is that it's sort of trying to push towards these reforms that are targeted to develop the kinds of skills like answering the phone for big corporations, that companies would need workers to have, right? And so you could see that in the case of Mexico, there's sort of a backstory there, right? Mexico belongs to the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation. There's 37 member countries. Actually, the newest member country is Colombia. You guys joined the OECD just a few months ago in April, so congratulations, I guess. And the OECD then is, as I said, this organization that tries to promote, economic development for all their member countries. And one of the ways they do that, one of the instruments they have is something called PISA. PISA is the Program for International Student Assessment. Basically, what it is that all the countries have to, that are as part of the OECD, all the countries have to do these sort of national tests and report the results of these tests to the OECD. And so the PISA report ends up being really, really important because it allows them to compare sort of the results of the education system, sort of the relative strength of the education system across all of the different OECD countries. And starting this year in 2020, English as a foreign language is now going to be one of the sort of basic things that the countries have to report on the PISA results. And so again, English sort of creeps in there as an important thing. And so you can see economic development, education reform, and English, these things sort of start to become kind of more and more closely linked, right? And the impetus, as I said, for the English program in Mexico, they talked about this program for, years and years, all the presidential candidates, again, would always say inglés y computación, right? It's promising this. It never happened, again, because it's really expensive and complicated to do it. Finally, in 2009, they finally were able to launch the program. And really, the main impetus was that a few years prior, Mexico had been ranked the absolute lowest. Back then, there was 30 OECD countries. Mexico had been ranked the very lowest. And so the government was like, oh my God, what do we do? Our education system is really weak. They commissioned this big study, this big research group to come in and like figure out what's wrong and how do we reform our education system. And here's part of the it's called the Hopkins report. Here was part of the conclusions of this report. The authors of the report said that in general, the Mexican education system needs to rapidly improve human capital development, and the reforms already in place. And so you think that's kind of a strange way to think about, the education system in terms of human capital development. But again, that's the way economists, that's the way they think about it, right? The whole point of education is to develop human capital. As teachers, we think my job is to like help my students learn stuff, right? And sort of improve themselves. But for economists, the point of education is to develop human capital, which again, strikes us as strange, but it really shouldn't. This is, again, part of this sort of what we would call a neoliberal view of education. Neoliberalism, you probably know, is this sort of political and economic doctrine, tightly bound up with capitalism, of course, that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private rights. And so in a neoliberal view, the role of education is to develop human capital, including linguistic capital, right? That's where English comes in. English is linguistic capital in most parts of the world as the preeminent global language, right? And so, again, you suddenly see that English programs and educational reforms now get tied to things like the World Bank, and they get tied to these very large, powerful multinational corporations, right? All right. Well, a little bit more about human capital theory. The idea of this, or sort of the theorization of this, comes from Becker, who was an economist. He actually won a Nobel Prize for this work. And again, it's this idea that education is an individual investment that is going to be beneficial to society because the individual that you've invested in will therefore be able to contribute more to society, right? And so that knowledge and skills acquired through education are going to increase that individual's productivity enough to justify the costs that you invested in them, right? So, sort of in the traditional view, a person of at least from an economic standpoint, I'm totally not endorsing this, of course, but traditional view is, the sort of the value of the person as human capital is whatever you can produce, right? In the old days, if you are unskilled labor, it's whatever your physical body can produce, right? Maybe not even so historically, because as you see here, there still is, exploitation and child labor happening. That's not something that, is just something that happened in the past that doesn't happen anymore. So, there's that view. To the corporations, then, these children here, their value is whatever they can produce for the company, right? Over and above whatever I have to pay you. And so the formula looks a little bit like this, right? You've got the person there, your physical, human being on the left, and then you give them, you have to invest to give them some skills and whatever the skills are that you need in order for them to be able to produce more, and that will increase your profits. And as long as the increase in the profits is more than whatever you had to invest in them to teach them those skills, well, then it was, as economists would consider, a good investment, right? And so this is where English education comes in. English then becomes the linguistic skill that's valued in the global marketplace. That's why we need to invest in Programa Nacional de Bilingüismo, PRONI, whatever all these different all these different English programs are, because again, that investment is going to be worth it if we give kids the skills that they need, right? And so if you kind of translate it like that through this idea of human capital theory, that quote that I said, the quote that I heard from parents and teachers all over the place when I was doing the project, El inglés te abre muchas puertas, what that kind of really means then is that learning English gives you a skill that adds to your value as human capital because of its potential to increase your profits for your employer. Again, from a human capital standpoint, right? Probably not what they actually meant when they said el inglés te abre muchas puertas, but it also kind of gets us to think about then, well, what really, for us as educators, what do we want the purpose of, education, particularly for those of us that work at primary level, what do we want the education to be about? Most of us would probably say we don't think of education as a jobs training program, right? Really, what we think of those other points there, we think about education as something that, is going to help kids to understand the world, to better themselves, to develop critical and analytic thinking skills, peer interactions, ethical and moral values of society. That's kind of what we think of, as teachers then, about the value of education. But again, when you look at sort of what actually happens in classrooms or in English lessons, as I said, in these 3 different classrooms, you find that the pedagogy and the rationale that teachers use actually, really does support this idea of human capital, right? So I would say, again, we think about this and we can connect this to the broader work being done in TESOL and applied linguistics here. And I would say going all the way back to, there was a very important seminal work by Robert Phillipson called Linguistic Imperialism. And so it really is kind of an updating or an extension of this argument here. And Nelson Flores says, we really need to revisit that and sort of think about it through this lens of neoliberalism here. He says the major argument made by these scholars is that TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages in a neoliberal context, has produced a new global market for English language teaching that has increased the profits of transnational corporations while reinforcing existing hierarchies between Anglo-American nations and the rest of the world's population. And so I think Flores is, his strong critique of it. I think it's right on. So just to summarize in the last 3 or 4 minutes here, I would say that we should think about then the assumptions of the discourse of English for everyone and this idea of English opens doors. There again, think of that at sort of the discursive ideological level and really question or interrogate what's going on there. I think if we think about carefully about social class and the role of social class and how that, again, the hidden curriculum sort of in an invisible social reproduction kind of way shapes what happens in classrooms. And that, again, we see that English, it doesn't take too much to sort of connect the dots between English language teaching, educational reforms, and this idea of neoliberalism and the development of human capital, right? And again, if you're thinking of this sort of from a research perspective here, we're trying to sort of document kind of what's going on in the classrooms. I would say that, you're looking at how pedagogical practices and educational processes align with teachers' expectation and what we would call the positioning of students, right? The way that, again, we think about the possibilities of the potential for students. Again, that's not intentional. I'm not saying the teachers are like bad by doing this. Again, this makes sense to them. And again, you ask them about it, it seems like a perfectly reasonable explanation that they give, but it really does respond again to this tendency of social reproduction. What is the potential, the possibility for working class kids, middle class kids, and more affluent kids, right? And so again, this is generally influenced by a neoliberal view of students as future human capital for companies. So I would say by way of conclusions, I would say that, social class does shape English teaching. Again, it's not intentional, but it responds to this tendency for social reproduction. That the hidden curriculum refers to how pedagogical practices, educational processes align with teachers' expectations. And I would say finally then that, the great majority of students in Mexico, opportunities to develop actual proficiency in English, these are the result of socioeconomic prosperity, not the precursor to it, right? So it's like the chicken and the egg thing. I think the argument that, we introduce English into the curriculum and that's going to lead to greater equality is like backwards, right? We have to recognize that that's not really what happens when we look at actual processes here. So I would say, for us, that the challenge is then for us as English language educators then is to think about, how can teaching be a means for raising critical consciousness and resistance? And again, I would point to my colleague, Mario Lopez Copar, who's done really excellent work coming at this from sort of a post-colonial framework, right? And, for us then in the classroom, or thus that work in language teacher education, what can we do at a practical classroom level? How does that awareness then translate into sort of actual lessons and activities that we do with students that try to get at these kinds of things, right? And so I think these don't have great answers for this. It's sort of open-ended questions. I think that, things that we can consider and think about as sort of researchers, language teacher, educators, and classroom teachers, right? So here's the references. I mainly these were the two recent pubs that I had that I was drawing on for this talk. And I think Jose, you're going to moderate the questions for us. And I also have my email and website there. If we don't get to all the questions and you want to follow up with me, I'm more than happy to continue the conversation on email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sayer. It has been a real pleasure to listen to you. And it has prompted quite a lot of comments indeed in the chat about language policies in Latin America. And indeed, it prompted many comments concerning the new integration of Colombia to this organization, international organization, in terms of neoliberal policies. So some comments to begin. Nixon Alexandro Gamba says that these insights are very useful, not only to reflect about the different variables regarding bilingualism and ELT processes, but also to think about how to address public policies in these terms. Most of the comments are really thank you for this amazing presentation. And here we have a question from Daniel Calderon Aponte. He says, in terms of access and equity, following Orwell's idea, could we say that within English for everyone, all students are equal, but some students are more equal than others?
Right. Yeah, I think that's probably a good way of putting it, right? Because again, I mean, if you think about it in terms of access, and again, you look and see sort of what kinds of access that again, I was trying to sort of make a portrait of that with the comparison across 3 schools, right? But again, when you go in and look at sort of what's happening with an eye to social class, what you'll see is, the idea of some students being more equal, is certainly when it comes to English, is that they've got all sorts of different, sociocultural possibilities that are the result of their socioeconomic position, right? What I mean by that is, like, if you look at, we did another study of like looking at how do kids engage with English outside the classroom, right? What do they do when they're not taking English class? What do they do with English outside? And again, you saw that again, this pretty well mapped on to social class, so that, more affluent kids, again, they've got, a Nintendo Switch, and they were doing this, various things online in English. They'd, traveled with the family to the US. That English, again, was sort of part of, the music they were listening to, and in a lot of different ways they were engaging with English. It didn't seem like foreign at all. It was very much just, part of their linguistic reality, their linguistic repertoire, right? Whereas that for other students then who didn't have those sorts of opportunities, they don't have internet connection at home. They certainly don't have any possibility to be, traveling outside Mexico. That, again, that wasn't really part of their reality, right? And so again, the question of access is like, well, how do you make equal access when, the playing field is not at all level, when the kids are, as you're saying, so much more equal than others in terms of where they're coming from in terms of learning English, right? So yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's a good point.
Thank you so much. There is actually another question here from Dr. Harold Castañeda. He asks, can you foresee ways for ELT teachers and students from different social classes to subvert such neoliberal paradigm in language education?
Well, I would say yes. The sort of like straight up critical Marxist view of this would be that, again, the schools, our education system, is an ideological state apparatus, or part of that ideological state apparatus. So by definition, it has to reproduce itself. That's a very sort of Althusserian kind of view of sort of what schools are, and you're just too bad, right? And so that we need a much more radical approach, what Ilan Ivic would call deschooling society, right? And so that's sort of like the very radical answer is like, no, if by definition the school is part of the state needs to sort of protect itself, and so therefore it needs to reproduce the social order. That's sort of a very pessimistic view of it, right? Because I'm like, okay, well then where does that leave us? And so you kind of have to be to be more optimistic about it. You do sort of have to think, well, no, I mean, schools, or at least individual teachers with critical consciousness, can be agents of social change. They can affect change within their, within at least the spaces that we have to control, right? And so, yeah, there's certainly things about the system, the schooling system, the curriculum, textbooks. I mean, the rules and policies. I mean, there's certainly things that are like way beyond our control. But, there are a lot of things that we have as, our libertad de cátedra, as we would say there, I have agency as a teacher. My students have agency as human beings to do things that are in our self-interest. And so, again, if we can kind of sort of see very clearly how neoliberalism is affecting it and how those sort of underlying processes are shaping it. And we're not acting, as Marx would say, out of false consciousness of sort of like blindly reinforcing the social order. Then, if we can get that sort of awareness or consciousness, then I do think there are a lot of possibilities to try to resist, subvert, disrupt in various ways, right? And that's what what I meant by those open questions at the end. Is that's what I'd love to see. That's what for me is really inspiring, is to see a teacher who teaches a lesson that really takes that on, right? If it's like a lesson that kind of gets the concept of critical intercultural awareness, or I don't know, just things like that are really inspiring approaches. And so you're right, here in the way that I was presenting this, and for the sake of time, I wanted to sort of present the comparative case study as a way of illustrating this. But also I think there are a lot of good counter examples of that. I mean, in the sense of like teachers who didn't follow those patterns, teachers who kind of broke the mold. And I think those are sort of the sources of inspiration that we need to look to, of how really critical educators can engage with these things in a meaningful way in English classes with their students. So I would love to, I don't know if you guys have examples of that in the Colombian context. I think that's what we should look to for inspiration.
Thank you so much. In that train of thought, we have a comment and a question. The first is coming from Javier Sierra. He says, as I can see, market/corporate-based pedagogies do not account for students' cultural capital in terms of Bourdieu. Instead, they place an array of deficit-oriented policies on students, which in turn do not acknowledge local forms of knowledge. So this is one of the comments, but here we have a question from Dr. Amparo Clavijo. She says, could English teaching and learning be about getting to understand our own reality first, rather than learning about others' reality, local/global issues?
Yeah, I think both of those, the first comment, I think almost answers that question, right? I think that was exactly right. Really, really well said, Sierra, or whoever made that first comment. Because, that's what we would define as, has different names: culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally sustaining pedagogy. There's different sort of versions or names for it, but that's really what I think is at the root. I think in language education, in other areas, they've sort of started to sort of understand what that means. I think that's what we need to take up in English language education, is to sort of see how does that fit in, an EFL context in Colombia. Like, what does that really mean, right? When we say like funds of knowledge, it's like, yeah, that's great. Like, let's use the kids' funds of knowledge as the cultural capital with which to base. Like conceptually, I'm like totally on board. So like, how does that translate into practice then, right? What does that look like at the level of, at a pedagogical level? So I think you're absolutely right. Again, at the conceptual level, you said it perfectly. But I think the second part, the question then is sort of like, okay, at the practical level now how do we do that, right? Because you're right, that doesn't sort of immediately translate into like, well, here's the method, or here's a textbook, and here's it's like, again, something that we need to think of as teachers in a very sort of local sense, right? And so again, I think that's the sort of the connection of like, okay, English is a global language, but how do we teach it in a locally, how do we appropriate that in a local, highly contextualized kind of situated way? So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sayer. I think we have time for a very last question again from Dr. Clavijo. She asked, how does learning English in Mexico and Colombia relate to critical literacies, local knowledge, and recognizing our own social, cultural, political, and linguistic landscape?
Yeah, again, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I'm the right one to answer that question, right? I think that's the question for you guys there. I mean, I think in a general sense, the previous comment was, again, at least at a conceptual level, that's the answer to that question. But you're right. That's where, again, I think that's the value of sort of this ethnographic work. I think that's the value of work that tries to, to situate the language pedagogy within that framework that, critical literacies in the framework that you just said. So I don't know. I don't know how to answer that in a real specific way that would actually say something to the Colombian context, because again, I'm sitting here in Columbus, Ohio, and it would be very presumptuous to try to say, oh no, you in Colombia do it this way. I don't think that's totally antithetical to the point of that critical approach, right? To critical pedagogy. It has to be something that, again, is generated from a bottom up, in a locally relevant kind of way. So I think you're right. You're asking exactly the right question, but I'm like exactly the wrong person to answer that. I want to put that back on you guys, or how you guys would answer that. So.
Thank you, Professor Sayer. Yeah, actually, the Colombian milieu is, and some of the scholars here in the field of ELT are trying to disrupt these.
I would say, one thing that I've been really impressed with, and I know that, there's folks there, for example, that are working on the integration of peace education and in post-conflict Colombia with English language teaching. I think, that to me is the example of how you do that, right? I mean, those are the sorts of things that, is something that, again, in the Colombian context is really what we need to get at, right? And so, but again, that would look different in each place. That's going to look different in Columbus than in Bogota, right? So.
Thank you, Professor. Well, we have had different comments, all of them thanking you for such an amazing presentation. We really thank you. And on behalf of the Masters in Applied Linguistics, once again, we would like to express our most sincere gratitude for taking the time to join us and to share your experience and your knowledge with the Colombian milieu. So thank you so much, Dr. Sayer. In case that anyone would like to address him directly, I think that he already shared his email. And we would like to thank all of you, our audience, for attending to this plenary session. Now I would like to give the word to Professor Álvaro Quintero, who is going to close the 26th International Symposium in Applied Linguistics. So thank you so much, all of you, for attending. Thank you all for your comments. We really appreciate it. And once again, Dr. Sayer, you're very welcome to Colombia and to share your knowledge here with us.
Thank you, Jose.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you, Peter, for such a very insightful talk. Okay, we have reached the end of our 26th International Symposium on Research in Applied Linguistics. And I guess this is the time that I have to mention different names and thank them for helping in the organization and development of our event this year. We were able to put together a program for an online event for the first time. There are many things to learn, many things to refine for further events that we hope are not online events. We also think that things are going to get better for the future years. And we are hoping also to get together in person again so we can share and socialize around some issues that relate to the field of applied linguistics. First of all, I would like to thank again the keynote speakers that have accepted my invitation for this year's symposium. The keynote speakers this year were Dr. Carlos Granados from Institución Universitaria colomboamericana, única, here in Colombia. Dr. Mario Lopez Gopar and Vilma Huerta Córdoba from Universidad Autónoma Benito Juárez de Oaxaca, Mexico. Dr. Peter Sayer from the Ohio State University in the United States. I would also like to thank the Colombian Applied Linguistics Journal authors Yolanda Zamacá and Jimena Bonilla. Definitely, I would like to include in this list the 45 authors and presenters of around 48 concurrent sessions between yesterday and today. Also, some colleagues who also collaborated with the reviewing of the proposals for this symposium this year, who made up the scientific committee of this event. Gary Barcusen from Auckland University, New Zealand, Brian Meadows from Seton Hall University in the United States, Liliana Cuesta from Universidad La Sabana in Bogotá, Berta Ramos Holguín from Universidad Pedagógica y Tecnológica de Colombia, Jimena Bonilla from Universidad Distrital, Pilar Méndez from Universidad Distrital, Carmen Elena Guerrero from Universidad Distrital. They collaborated with reviewing the proposals and helped us make a selection of the 48 presentations that I just mentioned. Also, I would like to thank all the students of semester 2 of our master's program. They were the hosts of all the presentations. I guess they did a very, very good job hosting all the presentations and conducting and moderating all the sessions. I would also like to thank a la Red de Investigaciones de Tecnología Avanzada, RITA, from our university, for supporting with the broadcasting of the plenary sessions. They were in charge of the live streaming of these plenary sessions. Of course, in collaboration with the Language Institute of our university, Instituto de Lenguas de la Universidad Distrital, ILUD, who this year's, the team from ILUD collaborated in the organization of this year's symposium, and I hope the following events in the following years, they can also be with us as a team. I would also like our student assistant from Licenciatura en Educación Básica del Inglés, Angela Franco, who is our assistant for this semester, who also worked very hard in the organization of the communication with the presenters and organization all the information about each proposal, and she helped also in putting together the program, the final version of the program this year. One of the, I guess, one of the lessons, there are many things that we have learned from the talks that we attended this year, but I would like to highlight at this point, one of the lessons that I guess I have learned personally is that there is a two-way type of movements that student teachers are making back and forth from classroom, from school and classrooms to outside communities to inquire into social, cultural, political, ideological issues associated to language education. And related to that, I could say that in the past, in the field of applied linguistics, probably there was an emphasis on encouraging student teachers to conduct studies within classrooms. And later in a transition, we were encouraging teachers to study issues associated to language education outside schools. But now from the presentations this year, I could say that we should not stay in one of the two extremes. I guess we should encourage student teachers to move back and forth from schools to the outside communities and from the outside communities to schools. And I guess that is one of the lessons that I learned from our symposium this year. So after this, we are going to start working in the organization of next year's symposium. Again, thank you very much to all the attendees and the presenters who participated this year. The list of institutions that participated in our event this year is a very long list. I am going to mention some of them. Universidad Pontificia, Pontificia, Universidad Javeriana, Secretaría de Educación Distrital de Bogotá, Colegio San Tarcisio, Universidad La Salle en Bogotá, School of Languages de la Universidad Pedagógica y Tecnológica de Colombia, Universidad Autónoma de Baja California en México, Colegio San Viator, Institución Educativa Luis María Jiménez, Universidad Antonio Nariño, Universidad del Bosque, Universidad de Cartagena, University of Adelaide in Australia, Universidad La Gran Colombia, Universidad Nacional de Colombia, Universidad Pedagógica y Tecnológica de Colombia, Escuela de Administración de Negocios, EAN, Universidad de Caldas, Grantsboro College, Universidad de Quintana Roo, of course, Universidad Distrital, Universidad Pedagógica Nacional de Colombia, Universidad Tecnológica de Pereira, Universidad de Pamplona, Instituto de Lenguas de la Universidad Distrital, Universidad del Tolima, EAFIT, Universidad Abierta y a Distancia de Colombia, Smart Institute, Institución Educativa Ofelia Uribe de Acosta, Colegio Divino Salvador, Universidad Surcolombiana, Instituto Técnico Industrial Julio Flores, Universidad de La Sabana, Universidad Manuela Beltrán, Colegio Jorge Gaitán Cortés, Universidad Liceo Hermano Miguel Lasalle Unipanamericana, Universidad Industrial de Santander. También tenemos la Universidad Autónoma Benito Juárez de Oaxaca, México, la Universidad del Estado de Ohio en Estados Unidos, la Institución Universitaria Colombo-Americana Única en Bogotá. Okay, like I said, this is a long list. I hope I have mentioned all the institutions that participated this year. So with this, I guess we have reached, as I said, the end of our symposium this year. Thank you very much again to all the presenters and the attendees and all the students of our program who also participated in the logistics of the event. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day and a nice weekend. I hope to see you around very soon.